Good evening. My name is Barsha Mondal and I am a part-time lecturer in the Department of English, Rabindra Bharati University, Center for Distance and Online Learning, Kolkata. I welcome you to the stories of tribal identity and culture that will explore the role of tribal history and tribal representation in history in shaping cultural identity and ideology, curated under TMYS Review December 2024 in collaboration with the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, University of Victoria. We are also calling for the submission of essays, poems, and short stories under this project. To know more about the submission guidelines and project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. This evening, I consider myself very privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Dr. Indrani Sigamany, Dr. Ishwar Naik, and Dr. Smita Mishra Panda, who will shortly share their views and insights with us. The topic for today's discussion is role of environmental consciousness in cross-culturalization. Before we begin, I would like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Dr. Indrani Sigamany. Dr. Sigamany is a researcher and senior international development consultant. She has received her PhD degree from the Center for Applied Human Rights, York Law School, University of York, England. Her MA in Gender and Development from the International Institute of Social Studies, The Hague, and another MA in Social Work from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Her research explores gender and legal responses to the displacement of indigenous people from their ancestral lands in India. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, Dr. Sigamany. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our second speaker for the session is Dr. Ishwar Naik. Dr. Naik is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, Odisha. Previously, he has worked as a chairperson of the Council of Deans and associate professor of sociology in the School of Tribal Legal Studies and Tribal Rights, Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, KISS, Bhubaneswar. He has received an MA degree in sociology from JNU in 2003 and a PhD degree in sociology from JNU in 2010. He has more than 12 years of teaching and research experience. His research interests include environmental movements, Dalit and tribal movements, tribal sociology, social stratification and inequality, development and local governance, rural sociology, and caste and tribe in India. He has presented more than 25 research papers in national and international seminars and conferences in India and abroad, and is also the author of 3 books. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Nayak. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our third speaker for the session is Dr. Smita Mishra Panda. Dr. Panda is a professor and director of research at Centurion University of Technology and Management, Odisha. She is a gold medalist from Delhi University in the subject of social anthropology and rural regional development planning and has her PhD degree from the Asian Institute of Technology, Thailand. Her research and consulting focuses primarily on gender and development, natural resource management, governance, rural development, indigenous people, and transgender issues. She has around 30 years of teaching, research, and consulting experience in Southeast Asia and South Asia. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Panda. Thank you for joining us this evening. We will now open the forum for discussion. I would request Dr. Sigamany to share her insights with us. Ma'am, over to you now.
Okay. Hello, greetings, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I thank Barsha and TMYS for inviting me to speak. And I'll just open well, no, let me just say that my professional background, from the point of view of what I'm speaking, is international development and poverty and indigenous land rights and human rights. And so that will be, the background, the foundation of where I'm coming from. And I'm just, in the next few minutes, I'll just touch upon three aspects. I just also want to say that I'll use the words indigenous and tribal interchangeably. Okay, so I will give a quick overview of what the Forest Rights Act says about conservation and indigenous rights. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the knowledge of conservation among tribal and indigenous communities. And thirdly, I just want to highlight the gender disparity of how displacement affects women in particular. And the reason I'm talking about displacement is because that is what my research is based on, is displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. And I look at it using the Forest Rights Act. So in terms of the Forest Rights Act, 2006, the basically in relation to what we're going to talk about today, it recognizes customary forest lands and usufruct and habitat rights of tribal and indigenous peoples in India. And it also aims to encourage community participation and, most importantly, community management and protection and conservation of forests and wildlife. Now, this formal recognition of the contribution of indigenous peoples to the environment and preservation subscribes to the progressive new paradigm of conservation, which views people as central to the protection of nature and evidences the importance of human participation in conservation. And it talks about sustainability. And this contradicts the classic paradigm, which is also known as fortress conservation, where we remove people from areas, close them off for biodiversity, and that argues that people cause destruction to biodiversity, while the new paradigm says people are actually intrinsic and vital to the preservation of biodiversity. So the Forest Rights Act is framed in progressive rights-based language, and but I want to question the effectiveness of legal standards protecting the needs of indigenous and tribal populations in India. So, whether the obligation for the implementation of these standards is being met satisfactorily by the Indian government and the Forest Department is, I think, a big issue. And and we also, I was listening just this week to a seminar by India's Land Conflict Watch, and they raised the question of whether it was the Forest Department itself and the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, which could be creating barriers to justice for indigenous and tribal peoples. So there are two articles of the Act, of the Forest Rights Act, that are pertinent here for this discussion. And firstly, it's that land can only be inherited and not transferred by any other means. And secondly, that any government decision involving forest lands has to be endorsed by the Gram Sabhas, which are the local village assemblies, by the Gram Sabhas concerned, which is actually a wonderfully participatory and democratic aspect of this act. However, both these particular aspects are repeatedly violated by our own government, which continues to transfer vast tracts of land to extractive industries without Gram Sabha permission. And recently, in the last few years, the very Gram Sabha permission itself, which was this, very important aspect of the Forest Rights Act, is being disregarded, just, openly disregarded. So When being displaced from forest lands on which resident tribal communities depend, they lose their habitat, they lose their food, they lose their livelihood, and often ancient cultural and spiritual connections. Another big loss, which we don't talk about very often, but is important for a conservation, is traditional knowledge. The ability
I
to
don't
pass
think
on
there
to their
is
future
so much problem.
generations their traditional knowledge of managing highly varied natural environments for
Because
their
someone
livelihood
कहाँ पाई हो रही
and
थी?
food production. They
देखो
have
सर्टिफिकेट के
managed
लिए कनेक्ट कर
adapting
ना
मुझे
to
कुछ करने ना
their
मुझे
changing
बोलो
environments, which includes but is not limited to aspects such as sustainable food production, conservation, disaster management, and sustainable water resource management. So, this ability to adapt comes from holding ancient knowledge of managing highly
it is
varied
still a big
natural
problem.
environments for their livelihood and food production. For example, with mobile indigenous peoples, which who are the nomads or pastoralists, their unique knowledge and practice of pastoralism and of ethnobotanical knowledge is this stewardship, which includes conserving and enhancing the genetic diversity of domestic animals and plants. So, this knowledge is reflected in customary indigenous laws, also referred to as traditional law, which also is given a nod to by the Forest Rights Act. So I'll go on to my second point, which is knowledge of mobile indigenous peoples. But I was just wondering, Barsha, if everybody could just put their mics on mute, because I can hear background noise. Okay, thanks. Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you. So this my second point is knowledge of mobile and the knowledge. So I'm just going to talk about the knowledge. So this flexible and adaptive management approaches of indigenous peoples has become much more relevant now under and much more valuable because of this extreme climate challenges and global warming conditions, and which of course most scientists believe has been caused by industrialization and corporate development. And an important aspect of indigenous knowledge is the indigenous experience of developing strategies of sustainability, particularly in the use of natural environments and in responding to environmental change. So, mainstream food production systems, for example, depend on rainfall and predictability, and climate change exacerbates predictability. And 40% of the world's land has unpredictable rainfall. The attempt by mainstream agriculture to control the variability of the natural environment creates the struggle for sustainable agriculture on one hand and for food production, while indigenous communities such as pastoralists on the other hand have developed strategies, ancient strategies over thousands of years, which use variability to their advantage. So they actually use the variability, working with the fluid changeability of climate, which means that their climate strategies are much more, their environmental strategies are much more sustainable than strategies which focus on or which depend on predictable rainfall. So another example is herder conservationists. So pastoralists have deep knowledge of how to stabilize the grazing lands patterns, matching their mobility to the variable landscape, and how to track and combine forage plants which contain high concentration of nutrients for their herds. A big issue and threat to the mobile indigenous community specifically is that their knowledge, which is closely connected to the patterns of movement from one area of low natural resources to another, is largely unrecognized. And the whole mainstream just doesn't, mainstream communities just do not recognize that indigenous peoples have this ancient knowledge especially the Western international community, does not work with it. And national governments generally dismiss or deny that indigenous knowledge systems exist, especially governments subscribing to neoliberal economic systems. So governments continue to subscribe to post-colonial fortress conservation efforts, which remove indigenous communities from ancestral lands in order to create these pristine landscapes, biodiversity areas devoid of people. So the last point I want to bring up is the gender aspects of this knowledge. So indigenous women are the people who uphold this ancestral wisdom, and they play a vital role in preserving the world's biodiversity. Their knowledge is rooted in ancestral understanding of the natural world and the accumulation of observation of local phenomena. So the most significant aspect of Indigenous women holding and preserving these traditional knowledge is their holistic approach, which encompasses a wide range of domains beyond, mere specialization. They possess an intrinsic understanding of various species, considering their nutritional value, medicinal properties, and ecological role. And this knowledge is passed down through generations. Not only, it doesn't only enrich their communities, but it's been actually crucial for Western science, which we don't know about. I mean, it's not talked about. And Indigenous women's insights have often informed Western understandings, leading to development of medicines and a deeper understanding of climate phenomena such as droughts, floods, and biodiversity migration. However, despite their invaluable contributions, Indigenous women's roles continue to be marginalized, often relegated to the status of beneficiaries rather than recognized as partners and agents of change. They face intersecting challenges due to their gender and Indigenous identity and endure various forms of discrimination. So I just want to go through a quick few points about the women. So at the intersection of both mobile and settled, so we have mobile Indigenous communities and settled Indigenous communities, is this specific gender differential that forced migration affects women differently. So this is what I'm talking about, displacement and forced migration. So when women are forced to migrate away from their traditional lives in forest environments, which is happening because of biodiversity and closing the areas off to Indigenous and tribal peoples, women actually continue to face more extreme discrimination when forced to migrate away from their ancestral lands, because their livelihoods are based on the forest economy. And they are the community keepers of ecological knowledge and conservation, and they safeguard nature. So when they are pushed out into the mainstream, their role is completely, upturned. In general, also tribal women, this knowledge is passed down. It's verbal, passed down verbally and through stories. But in general, they tend to be less literate than men and also less exposed to public institutions. So they are actually, when it comes to negotiating their legal rights, when they're displaced or forced to migrate, they face bigger challenges because of their gender and Indigenous identity and how they are discriminated against by government officials. So they're known to face more discrimination from public officials when seeking justice and when threatened by displacement. And this has negative consequences for the rights of women that remains disempowering for many groups of women. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your valuable insights, especially regarding tribal women who have such knowledge but often remain doubly marginalized when it comes to any
Yeah,
kind of opportunities that are easily available to men.
right.
My next speaker is actually Dr. Smita Mishra Panda, but she seems to be having a very bad network connection. So I have to wait a little bit. Ma'am, would you be comfortable answering questions that I answering the questions? Uh, so, ma'am, my first question towards you for you is regarding the Forest Rights Act. The Forest Rights Act was initially implemented by the Indian government to ensure justice and protect those who have been denied a voice. But has the Forest Rights Act brought about any actual significant changes in the assertion of tribal rights over their lands? And could you explain regarding how far this act has reached beyond paper to engage with the realities of the marginalized?
Okay, so any legal response to any demands for justice is actually driven by the underlying political and economic ideologies of the elected government. And so access to justice cannot occur in a vacuum with the introduction of new legislation, however progressive. Because when the Forest Rights Act, which I will refer to as FRA, when the FRA was introduced, it was, very progressive and landmark legislation, and also one of the first in the world. The UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, came a year later. And so, on paper, the FRA's legislation has had, I would say, very uneven and divergent success in improving access to justice for Indigenous peoples. Some states have been more successful in recognizing land rights. Some states have a higher rate of claims of, land right claims by tribal people. But the points that we should look at is how progressively the substantive rights within a law are framed. Now, for the FRA, it's very progressive. And it takes in community participation. It takes in community forest rights, which is unusual, and it also, refers to gender. It refers to conservation. So it's very progressive. But then we have to look at whether the procedural rights are well defined and appropriate. And if those are well defined and appropriate, the third thing is how conscientiously and justly the procedural rights are enacted and can be realized by citizens. So that is the biggest question is, can we say we have this wonderful progressive piece of legislation? Can we say that it is conscientiously and justly enacted by the government and by the judiciary? So legal reform in many countries has the additional burden of trying to ameliorate the inappropriateness of the legal structure which was left over from colonial rule. And in India, for instance, we had the Sharia, the Hindu law. We have tribal law, which is based on mediation, and we have customary land laws. But in you can say that this legacy of colonial legal structures has left this inconsistency, and it means that we face a lot of contradictions between remaining legal statutes and new constitution. So this present governmentality is neoliberal. And it conflicts with this activist spirit of the Forest Rights Act. It just doesn't match. And the Forest Rights Act, also the procedural aspects, it's not in line, it doesn't align with the authoritarian governmentality of the Forest Department. And the Forest Department often obstructs the progressive rights that the forest peoples are potentially promised through the Forest Rights Act. And I mean, claims, for land rights, if you look deeper, they've found that these claims are sometimes they're rejected on a large basis, and sometimes they're rejected on very flimsy excuses, or due process has not been followed. So India's neoliberal government policies, it protects and reflects the priorities of the market, and which in doing so actually abandons the true purpose of the justice underpinning the FRA. So the role of the courts in constitutional framework is struggling with this contradiction of the recognition of universal. On the one hand, we have this universal human rights standards, and on the other hand, we have this expansion of the global neoliberal economy, and it just doesn't match. So I can go on a bit, but I'll stop there because I see Dr. Panda's come back.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Connect to my phone. I'm not very comfortable with the phone because my system is something wrong with the network. I don't know, something is happening. It doesn't connect through StreamYard.
It's
Phone
okay,
it does. But what will happen is I can show you my slides. Yeah, I had made some slides which would have been interesting, but it's okay. It's okay. I think we get going with what we have. But thank you very much for inviting me. I think our other speaker has permanently dropped out, or what is it? You can't see him.
Yeah. I can't see him.
Yeah. So thank you, Indrani, for this very wonderful. I mean, I don't pay attention for 80% of the time, but another 20% I was trying to figure out what's wrong with my network. Yeah, let's not dwell much on that. But I think much of what Indrani has already mentioned. Wonderful, you've been able to analyze and tell us about how what is happening to the tribals. Yeah, and why the kind of encroachment of the corporate power, the capitalist power, the capital, and say how it's encroaching on tribal lands and what's happening to their lives and livelihoods, and particularly, and how taking cue from there, I would have talked about environmental activism of tribal women, and particularly in Odisha, because I've done the studies here. Yeah, and it's not only in the context of environment, but also like looking at how they have been fighting against alcohol, illicit alcohol breweries, and alcoholism among men, domestic violence, right? And these are the things that we have studied in different parts of Orissa. But yes, against migration, forced migration. Yeah, but here I'll be talking about natural resources only, and how, because of the kind of extraction based industrialization, which is taking place, and how it has affected their livelihoods, and how women have really taken over this activism, and what is happening to their lives, and what is, what they are doing. So basically, I'll be talking about the little bit about the context, of Orissa. I think the other person also, speaker, was from Orissa. It would have been good to listen to him, but and then the second point in discussion of the discussion would be tribal women's activism and some final observations. You had given me only 10 minutes. Otherwise, I could go on and on. So, yeah, well, Orissa, as you know, I'm sure, Indrani, you know about Orissa and the concentration of tribals here. We are almost, 1/4 of the population, 23% of the population, total population, 62 tribes. Yeah. And also what is the irony is that Orissa has the tribals, the mineral resources, and the forests. They overlap. So they overlap. We are very rich in mineral resources, right? We have iron ore, coal, yeah, bauxite, chromite, and in abundance. So these companies, yeah, the multinational and mega national companies, yeah, they just flock to Orissa for and because of the policies of the government, as Indrani was mentioning, right? They flock to Orissa to extract minerals for uh, steel and aluminium. Yeah. But anyway, what is also happening is that if you want to get to the minerals, you have to displace the tribals. Yeah. You have to remove the forests. Until you do that, you can't get to the minerals. Right. So that is how we have to look at it. And this extraction based industrialization is being promoted by the government. Of course, there's politics and all that involved. Let me not get into it. I think we all know that these huge multinationals, how they bring in the money and they fund the elections and all that. I'll not get into it. And mining companies, yeah, they're very, very active in the state. They used to be very active, but now with time what has happened is at least the two big mega companies. POSCO has left Orissa probably, or probably some lurking around somewhere. But Vedanta is still here. But Vedanta is unable to operate, do any kind of extraction in the Niyamgiri Hills, yeah, which cuts across Raigada and Kalahandi districts, yeah, of Orissa. I am unable to show you anything on the screen, right? So there have been several movements all over the state, several movements, yeah, to protest against this kind of extraction-based industrialization. Yeah, there are about, I don't know, Purapot, Raigada, Kalahandi, Keonjhar, Sundargarh, Mayurbhanj, and Jajpur. These are the main, the areas where there has been, all these movements, yeah, very active. And you will find that and many of these movements, you'll find that women have spearheaded the movements. Yeah, women have spearheaded and sustained the movements. Men have also participated. It's not that men are not, into activism, but women have been able to spearhead, move ahead, and also have, you can say that the result of this kind of activism has led to something very positive for the tribals. Uh, I'm sure what I'm saying is you may. I'm sure Indrani knows about it, right? I don't know about Barsha, whether you know about the tribal movements. Yeah. So what I will be doing is I wanted to uh, give it some kind of perspective. The struggling bodies and spaces of resistance, which I have been writing on. You'll find a lot of my articles also in the net. You see, this is, I don't know if you know Tulasi Munda. Tulasi Munda is an activist from Keonjhar, from the Munda tribe, and she is a Padma Shri, right? And probably never into politics so much, but has been close to the politicians. Yeah. But she says that my sister pushed me to the mines when I was 5 years old. There were many children like me, and this harassment there because she wanted to educate herself and do something in life, but for a long time she couldn't do it. But she started, even in the mines, she started this this initiative of educating the children there, yeah, despite them working in the mines. So harassment has helped me to become courageous and taught me to face problems. Yeah, she's this Adivasi woman leader and winner of Padma Shri, which is the country's highest civilian award. uh, Civilian award. Yeah. Oh, okay. We have Dr. Naik back. So why activism? Yeah, why activism? Primarily because of loss of livelihoods. Yeah, loss of livelihoods, and the tribals are dependent on natural resources for their sustenance. Yeah, there's a and over the years, also what is happening is with continuous, this kind of loss of livelihoods, their identity as a tribe is also lost. You see, when they're forced to migrate and go to some city and work as some, somewhere where they're just not known as some unskilled worker, right? So the loss of identity is also happening. They're forced to migrate, mostly male migration. So women and children are left behind, and old people are left behind. Yeah, fragile environments, and also very difficult. They can't make ends meet. Yeah. Then there's also a lot of social friction because a lot of outsiders come into that area. A lot of outsiders, when they come into the tribal areas, there's a lot of social friction. Yeah, you can read that article of mine, which it's available in the public domain on environmental degradation and social friction in Orissa. Then, of course, the exploitation of the tribals. Yeah, exploitation of tribals by outsiders mostly. Yeah, when I say exploitation, it's mostly exploitation of the women, right? And there are some nice pictures which I'm unable to show you. Now, here I would like to discuss a bit about how women's bodies are sites of resistance. Yeah. So tribal women use their bodies as weapons for collective resistance. Now, these bodies, their own bodies, right, are mobilized in acts of resistance against the state and corporate power. Of course, they have faced a lot of the brutal aggression by the state, and I mean, I'm ashamed to say that the state is against its own people, right? But I can't say that so much openly. But yes, in a closed door kind of thing, yes, the state is against its own people. Yeah. How individually and collectively tribal women mobilize their agency. Yeah. By using their bodies, how they mobilize their agency to fight against these giants, the state and the corporate power. The body becomes a political site, therefore, for survival and their future. Here I've used Wendy Harcourt's and Escobar's, idea about the women and the politics of place. Yeah, women and the politics of place, where they say that personal is political. Yeah, personal is political, where they engage with the forces of capitalist encroachment on their sources of livelihood. Right. This is what I wanted to actually say, that how personal is political. Right. And I would say that most of the movements in Orissa, you will find the women who've actually gone along, and they've been able to sustain the movements over a long period of time. Yeah, over a long period of time, till they have come to some kind of a closure in terms of something that where they have been able to successful in ousting the companies, or have been able to stall things. We don't know how far it will be stalled, because who knows which government will come tomorrow, and already there's a change of government. We have the BJP now in Orissa. Who knows what will happen tomorrow? We just don't know. Right? Everything can change. Yes, men have also been very active, but women have spearheaded most of the movements, and its long-term sustenance. So what I would like to, yeah, my final observations is how I have tried to use the body, space, and spaces of resistance. Yeah, body, space, and spaces of resistance. How how it has been used as a metonymy for social and cultural transformations, and also for challenging and pushing new boundaries, practices, and autonomy over their livelihood sources. Using their bodies, tribal women have been able to create spaces of resistance. I think this is something we must give them credit. They've been able to create spaces of resistance or oppositional spaces, which was just not there before, right? Women have moved from excluded private space to a more included public space, right? Which is also politically assertive and strong enough to bring about change. Here we're talking about, how these marginalized voices are contributing to reformulating development, which has very strong transformative power. Yeah, that's how I would like to end it. Let's have a discussion. You've also asked me some questions. Yeah, Barsha, if you remember, and some of those questions, I don't know. Perhaps only one question I could answer very well, but the other two I'm not so. I know that something is happening when you're talking about climate change and all that, and how women, climate change. I can say, should I discuss the questions now? The answers to those
No,
questions?
No, ma'am, not now. At the question answer session. During the question answer.
Fine.
Ma'am, your
So that's how.
discussion kind of reminded me of Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi. There was a short story written by her, and it's completely upon this.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Okay,
Let's move on.
our third speaker for the session is Dr. Ishwar Chandra Nayak. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Because sometime I have a network issue, but now I try to settle now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Uh,
The space
yeah,
is
can I
yours, sir.
start now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. The space is yours.
Yeah, basically, the role of environmental activism in tribal movement in particularly context of rights and identity, particularly in the context of Odisha, I'm working in the four movement. Recently, we have one is Kasipur People's Movement against the Utkal Albina International Limited. Other one is Lanjigar Movement by the Vedanta against the Vedanta groups. The third one is the POSCO Movement at Jagat Singhpur, and the last one is the Kalinga Nagar movement. So the four movement in Odisha, particularly context, we have a two movement in the southern Odisha, particularly the tribal dominated area, and the two movement in the coastal area, non-tribal dominated area. But here the two movement the four movement, we have a two movement is succeeded movement and two movement is failed movement. So both kind of mixed kind of movement. If in the context of South Odisha, the Kasipur the environmental movement is basically the failed movement because it was not succeeded. And in Lanjigod, Raigada and Kalahandi, the border, the Dongoria Kondo people are living, and they succeeded the movement in that area. And in the context of the coastal Odisha, one is the success movement of the POSCO at Jagat Singhpur, and the failed movement, what I try to analyze in the context is the Kalinga Nagar, yes. And in the Kalinga Nagar, 13 people killed by the administrations, the police prashashan, when they have a peaceful movement. And why I use the Gandhian way of the movement, basically the tribal peoples, when they have a movement on that and they're peaceful, they wanted to strain themselves. And when they have a rally or any kind of movement, they have the traditional arms, yes. Whenever they coming out from the home, when they have a ox or maybe arrow, and kind of traditional way life of they have a. And when they have a rally at Kalinga Nagar in 2006 2nd January, in the peaceful way, and they have a lathi charge, then gas firing, and then they killed 13 people, killed in the sports, yes. And how the people, they wanted to suppress the people voice, because in I'm working on that also. The environmental activism, basically the people are looking for not issue on the environment, because people looking for the livelihood of that, yes. Major area, the tribal people are looking for livelihood, because around 6 months they depend on the forest for the livelihood, yes. And the forest gives them the fruits, the natural resources, everything for survive. And the next 6 months they have a kind of land for cultivations, yes. So kind of life they have in the tribal area. So if you are taking our forest, if we are taking our natural resources like water, and then jal, jamin, and jungle, we are talking about that, then how will survive, yes. If you are displacing us, and you are not resettling, you are displacing people, but you are not resettling in the tribal area, and they have to resettle, and they don't have that kind of atmosphere in the resettlement area, or rehabilitation colony. Everything what the natural resources they have in the village, they don't have in that the resettlement colony, yes. And like the water, they depend on the stream water, yes, river. And in still today we are celebrating the 75 years of Amrit Mahotsav, and the people are not getting the pure water in the tribal area. The depend on river, the depend on stream water, and you are not able to provide them, yes. And they don't have financial support to buy the mineral water from the market, yes, the pure water we are talking about. And the government has failed to provide the clean drinking water to them. and you are taking the natural resources from them, because the clean water they are getting from the stream, the river, particularly the stream area. Again, the land you are taking from them, and from generation to generation they are living and they're doing cultivation from land, and land is basically they are close to the heart. Yes, and you are taking them the land, and if you are taking land, then where they will go? And they are not educated like the others, the mainstream, what you are talking about, the mainstream uh, society, and how can they survive? And if you're taking the land, then what the livelihood of them? The question mark. Yes, and many way what we are talking about, the if and the land is related to the cultural perspective. Yes, many times the tribal people they depend on land as a cultural symbol. And if you are taking the land, then your culture is destroying the tribal community. You are taking the land, then you are destroying the tribal livelihood. And if you are taking the land, that we call that uh, uh, bhasha, if you are displacing them, again you are destroying the language of them. Because in the real area where the native people they are living, they have a kind of own language, but while they resettle they have to adapt to the new language, new cultural perspective, then everything what they have, you are losing them. Yes, and if your bhasha, your language is losing, your culture is losing, your land is losing, then everything you are losing. And that how the identity one of the major area for the tribal community. Yes, and if you are losing your culture and language, then you are not a part of the tribal community. And what the government of India, they have a defined the characteristics of the tribal. Yes, and language and the culture is a part of the characteristics of the tribal community. And you are losing that, then you are destroying, you are losing the tribal identity. And that was also a major issue for the tribal community. They lose the identity. Second is the cultural perspective. If you are taking the land, you are taking the culture, you are taking the language, everything, then you are destroying the cultural part of the tribal community, and they are everything they lose. Yes, and then again the occupational degradation also growing day by day, because some people when I doing research on the displaced people in southern Odisha, one family they were 3 times displaced. For imagine how the psychological problem they have. First they have displaced from the Upper Kolab hydropower project at Korapur, and same this resettle at the Nabrangpur area of nearby the Indravati river. And again the Indravati hydropower project they were started, again they displaced and they resettle at the Korap Kasipur, where the Almina Utkal Almina is resettled, and now they resettle, and again they displaced. So one family in the lifetime, the 3 times they were displaced. Then just imagine what the identity, what the psychological, what the cultural perspective they have. So everything they have destroyed, and that how a tribal movement is leading. Basically, the tribal people they be initiated, not supported by anyone, particularly in the context of South Odisha, the Niyamgiri and the Kasipur. Only the tribal people are leading the movement. Sometimes male, sometimes female, and the strategy is the Gandhian way. They have a demonstration or hartal or a rally. Then one of the strategy, because I am the part of the movement many times, because many people they know that I am the activist of them, but I'm doing research on that. And strategically, because the people they will use the police forces to attack the main forces. Yes, and to protect the men, the female are we are in the front stage. When we have a rally, we are moving female at the front, and the police forces they not cross from female to and attack the male. That kind of strategy they use when they have a rally or dharana. And many female like the Sumani Jodia, she was from Kasipur, and when Biju Patnaik was the chief minister in 1995, and she got a 91 to 95, and she got a SP power to stop alcohol spread in that Kasipur area, and she leading the Kasipur movement in that area. Yes, and then Sumani Jodia, then many people they are part of that movement. They are leading the movement. Yes, not only because they are the, and she said, we don't have anything, but we don't have a small land, piece of land for our survival. and sometimes we have a podu cultivation in South Odisha, the shifting cultivation we have a, and from that our livelihood is sustained. And if everything you are taking, then what our futures, what our identity, what our cultural identity, what our livelihood, everything will destroy. And that many people, those who are displaced, starting from, in particular in the South Odisha, I'm working closely on that. Ufor hydropower project at Kolhapur, 163 village displaced, and Balimela hydropower project at Malkangiri, 211 village displaced, and Upper Indravati hydropower project, 147 village displaced, and Nalco we have around 24 village displaced. Hindustan Aeronautics Limited at Sunaveda we have a 30 village displaced, and Kasipur officially they have 3 villages completely displaced, and around 26 villages are forcefully displaced because the mines they are taking from the forest area, and those who are living in the foothills of the mines, they are automatic, they have to displace. Yes, and that how the displaced people, where they go. Yes, and that the question again, many government, those are even Smita madam also mentioned, many are looking for the government is coming and government is going, but people they are saying that the government particular saying that development for those who are underdeveloped people, and if you are wanted to develop the project in that area, then people will get benefit of that. But who are getting the benefit? Development for whom, and who are getting the benefit of development? Yes, the major questions. Basically, those who are in the development area, people are those who are displaced area, they are not getting anything from that. Those who are outsider, they are getting benefit of that, because the local people, they don't have skill, yes, to work there. And those are skilled people, because they need the industry, the corporate, they need skilled people, and they borrow from outsiders. Yes, and that how the polarization also growing day by day in that area. Yes, so that how the major problem. And then yes, day by day the tribal and Dalit particular, they are more conscious on that, and they're trying to looking for their own rights. Yes, they're looking for their own rights, and they wanted to present, because they have to fight with two persons, one is the government, other one the corporate sectors. Yes, and two are the big player, and it's very difficult to fight with them. But yes, through the Gandhian way, through the non-violent, the peaceful way, they try to demonstrate dharana, then complain many way they are trying to protest. And sometimes I think, in London also, those are Avatar movie, they supported the Niyamgiri movement. So that how the international community were getting support from them, because the tribal are now in the destroying day by day, and the international community, the academics and the media, those are like-minded, the social activists, they are supporting outsiders. But many time, how the strategy the government are adopting, the movement is basically on the perspective, the government perspective, many tribal movement, particularly supported by the Naxalite, is not a true. Yes, the movement is not supported by the Naxalite. The movement basically they raised by the own tribal community, and supported by many like-minded peoples. Anyone those who are from outside, anyone those who are from academician, activists, and that leading to the mainstream tribal movement, and that the major issue for that, and they need a support from everyone. It's maybe anyone, maybe left or maybe right, or maybe international community or national community, anyone they need, because they are in the crisis, they help need. Yes, and that sometime the government and saying that yes, this is movement supported by Naxalite, this is movement supported by XYZ, but this is not true. They are looking for the own right, own identity they are looking for. So basically I try to link with that. So the movement is basically different perspective, cultural strain, different theoretical. But my understanding, my conclusion is that basically the tribal movement, the environmental movement, they have only the one is livelihood perspective, second one is the cultural perspective. Yes, and that is giving space for them. And that example with the Kalinga, the Niyamgiri movement, because that movement supported by honorable high Supreme Court of India, they have a Grama Sabha. And because in the tribal area, the Pesa area, you cannot do anything without the support or without the approval of the Grama Sabha. And the Grama Sabha is happening in the pen and paper by the government officers. Yes, in front of the police officer, in front of the army force, and that again the Honorable Supreme Court they ordered the Grama Sabha should be audio visuals recordings. Yes, and when they have a Grama Sabha, all people they will oppose. Yes, and the audio visual report, the video audio visuals report goes to the Honorable Supreme Court, and they said, you know, you cannot establish an industry in that area because the tribal people depend on nature for livelihood. The tribal people depend on nature for cultural perspective. The tribal people depend on nature for spiritual perspective. So everything depend on nature for livelihood. Yes, that is how is coming to the mainstream. Yes, the tribal movement. So thank you me for giving the chance. And anything in that question answer session, we can again more interactions. Thank you. Thank you.
Sir, thank you so much for your valuable insights. I believe that as a society, when we are constantly moving in the hurrying through in the name of progress, it is also important to sometimes stop and understand what we are sacrificing in the name of this progress. After all, like a progress that is based on the oppression of the marginalized is no progress at all. So now we move on to the question answer session. My second question is for Dr. Sigamany. Ma'am, uh, am I audible to you, ma'am? Okay. Ma'am,
Yes, I can hear you.
uh, ma'am, like, do you believe that it is only a matter of economic necessity for a country to be appropriating forest lands for the development of industries? Or is it that colonial mindset of prejudice and superiority complex that further claims its rights over the land that belongs to the indigenous communities who are often coercively marginalized?
Indrani,
Okay. Um, I think it's both. I think how it's done is makes a difference. Obviously, there has to be economic development within a country. India, for instance, is now number 5 in the world's GDP ranking. And Britain, which colonized India, is now number 6. So India has gone ahead. But what does that mean? And how was that GDP enhanced? These are important questions from, our perspective when we're talking about indigenous tribal peoples. If a government feels the need to evict tribal communities from their ancestral lands in order to sell or lease that land to private corporations for extractive industry, whether it be mining or hydroelectricity or timber, who gains from the profits of this industry? The bigger question to me is who loses? If one community, and we're talking about the tribal community, loses their forest dependence livelihoods, their homes, their forest dependent sources of food, herbal medicine, their cultural and spiritual traditions that we refer to right now, their knowledge of conservation, their loss is complete. And they have paid a huge price for this extractive industry, which is contributing to raising the national GDP. So then you can question the value of that GDP. Is GDP for whom? And if you analyze it from Amartya Sen's lens of Human Development Capability Index, you have extracted an enormous price and value from one community who is already economically marginalized, and you have impoverished them in ways that go beyond economic poverty. So that is definitely a post-colonial mindset. The colonial policies were about extracting resources from one community for the benefit of another, and benefiting one community by exploiting another. And both my colleagues here, Smita and Dr. Iswar, have been referring to exactly this: is you impoverish one community because you're extracting all the you're extracting resources from them for the benefit of other people, but where is the ethical, moral standards here? So, for instance, the UN special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, she says a decision which treats tribal peoples as possibly illegal residents of the forest is wrong. So indigenous peoples are owners of their lands and forests, and this phenomenon is seen around the world. Indigenous peoples and local communities are treated as squatters when in fact the land is theirs, and they have protected and stewarded their holdings for generations and play an important role for conservation. Unquote. That's a quote from her. So tribal communities and other forest dwellers are abandoned in India's political and in the legal and political sense in India. And this interface of power between the government and these type of marginalized citizens, in which the maintenance of marginalizing, indigenous communities is continued, then it's the same policies, and there's no change in the laws since the colonial period. I mean, in my opinion. So, I think that the legal environment in the post-colonial period was also strongly influenced by colonial jurisprudence. I mean, we have the Wildlife Protection Act, 1972, and the Forest Conservation Act, 1980, but they continue to force migration of indigenous peoples in India and prioritize the protection of wildlife over the housing and livelihood of, the protection of wildlife. They prioritize the protection of wildlife over those of indigenous forest peoples. And so in India, beginning with colonial period, when forest lands were expropriated as sovereign territory, forced migration of forest peoples was, set in motion. And economically, the neoliberal traditions of extracting mineral-rich forest resources began during the colonial period, and in my opinion, continue in the form of contemporary economic policies to the detriment and abandonment of the tribal communities who reside in the forest, and those who reside outside the forest. So these colonial legal systems allow no room for human rights, and by nature, I think they're authoritarian and exploitative and remain unaccountable.
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. My next question is for Dr. Panda. Ma'am, how far do you believe has modern technology such as social media and press helped in voicing out the crisis of tribal climate refugees? What has been the impact of the same?
Yeah, no, you had asked this, question. Of course, social media has helped in creating awareness, yeah, about tribal climate refugees. Yeah, that's the question you had asked me, in which I would say women are the worst affected. And why they're affected, what is happening to them. I think both my fellow speakers have been, presented. Also, Indrani just explained why it continues to happen and nothing changes. Yeah, and it's how it is so much against human rights. Yeah, it is. I mean, of course, there are so many other things happening around the world which is against human rights, right? And this is also one. Yes, tribal women. There are instances of how tribal communities, and particularly tribal women, how they are battling climate change. Yeah, by going back to their traditional methods of cultivation, particularly those millets and all those things, which they grow through sweetened cultivation or slash and burn cultivation. Yeah, which was not from which they were dissuaded by the government. Yeah, by the government, they were dissuaded. The state dissuades them from doing any kind of sweetened cultivation. And it is well known and also probably established that if sweetened cultivation or slash and burn cultivation, if you do it a little more scientifically, combine it with the other agroforestry practices, it is useful and it is very, very beneficial, and they can also sell their crops. But anyway, that is just not promoted because Sweden cultivation is considered to be environmentally harmful. Harmful because the fallow period has come down. The fallow period which they have, between different cycles of sweetened cultivation, that has come down. That is the reason why it is not environmentally feasible, right? So now these and particularly women. You see, I did field work for my PhD. I did field work in Gajapati district, in a place called Serango, the Gumma block, that side, and it is at a little higher altitude, and they are all into Sweden cultivation. And now there has been, and that was 27 years ago. And now when I go there, I went there and I find that everybody is into whatever little lands they have, for settled cultivation, they do that, or they're doing something else, or they're growing cashew, because that time cashew was being promoted in a cashew plantation, was being promoted in a big way by the government and IFAD, right? So many of them have taken to cashew culture. Now, but the women there, when I spoke to the women there, they told me that there is, that men are not into Sweden cultivation anymore. Anyway, Sweden cultivation was always the forte of the women. But now men don't even go to those fields, the Sweden plots. It's the women who are doing it. And they understand the value of the crops, especially the millets and the different varieties of vegetables and all that, hill paddy and all that. There's 16 to 17 varieties. There used to be 32. Now it has come down to about hardly 10 because they're not being able to grow all that, and it's getting lost. Yeah, through generations, it is just getting lost. Well, that's another issue. But then those are the crops which are actually helping them in fighting climate change, in battling climate change. Yeah, it's happening in some parts of of Orissa, but I have not really looked at it in detail. But I know that this is happening. Yeah, and there are several organizations, particularly environment CBOs, small CBOs, NGOs, who are trying to help the tribals, into what they could do to fight climate change. Yeah, because as Dr. Naik mentioned, that they don't have water. There's no water to drink. We can buy water, but they can't buy water. You see, so they have to depend on all kinds of unhealthy. It's not safe. They don't have access to safe drinking water. Yeah. So they are trying to get them back to the traditional ways of cultivation and conserving resources. And it is seen that by doing so, they have been able to, harvest water and get some, safe drinking water, right? And they have been also able to sustain themselves, although it is highly subsistence agriculture, livelihood. But they have been at least able to sustain themselves, yeah, instead of just leaving the place and going away. And many of them have done that, and that's what is, as you call, climate refugees, tribal climate refugees. And what happens to them? They go to the cities. They nobody knows them. They work as unskilled workers. Yeah, highly exploited, because tribals by nature are very different from the Hindu castes. Yeah, and we upper caste, the Hindu caste, they know very well how to exploit the tribals. Right, that is what is happening to them. So they're just unable to move up the economic ladder. Yeah, and it is so sad to see that there are the tribal communities who try and emulate the Hindu traditions, yeah, religious and all those traditions, because they think that is, at least they'll get some social status. At least it's better than being a tribal. But little do they know that they're always going to be referred to as Adivasi. Yeah, and we have a term in Odia, I'm sure Dr. Naik will understand, Moli Mundia. Yeah, Moli Mundia. I hope, yeah, Moli Mundia means, they are all, literally, if you translate Moli Mundia, it is like they have a lot of dirt in their head, in their hair. Yeah, or whatever. Yeah, so that is what, they're never going to be, considered as Hindus, even the lowest rung in the hierarchy. Yeah, of the Hindu castes, they will never be considered. They'll always be the other Adivasi, right? So that is what I have to say. But yes, I don't have any work which I've done, empirical work on looking at
Okay.
what is happening to, yeah.
My next question is for Dr. Nayak. Uh, Sir,
ये फिर आउट जाएगा तो ऊपर गुड़ा है
sir, you're not visible and audible.
this has been a problem, Barsha. Can we
Ah,
just and because this is already, you know, if we can have the next question to Indrani.
uh, ma'am, I have to like end the session since it's already over 1 hour. So,
Yeah.
so let's move on then. With that, we come to an end to tonight's discussion. I thank each one of you for sharing your knowledge and valuable insights with us. I'm sure our audience had a wonderful time and have learned a lot as well. We are grateful to you all for taking out time of your busy schedules and for being a part of this discussion. It was an absolute pleasure to have been in your company this evening. This is to remind that we are calling for submissions on tribal history and tribal representation in history, the details of which can be viewed on www.tellmeyourstory.biz. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good. Nice meeting you, Indrani. Nice meeting you,
Nice